Hello everyone. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have spent decades as a rabbi, guiding my congregation, offering counsel, and living by the sacred teachings of the Torah. To the outside world, my life seemed unwavering, my faith unshakable. I was the spiritual rock for so many, the one people turned to for wisdom and reassurance. But beneath that carefully constructed certainty, there were cracks, small, almost imperceptible at first, but growing deeper over time. I was raised in a deeply religious household, where the presence of God was not just spoken of, it was felt. My grandfather, a man of immense devotion, would sit me on his knee and tell me stories of Moses parting the Red Sea, of Elijah calling fire from the heavens. His voice carried the weight of conviction, and as a child, I clung to every word, awed by the miracles and the unwavering faith of the prophets. By the time I reached my teenage years, I knew my path was set. Becoming a rabbi was not a decision, it was a calling. I threw myself into my studies, immersing myself in scripture, spending long nights in quiet contemplation, dissecting the wisdom of ancient texts. When I finally stood before my congregation for the first time, delivering my inaugural sermon, I felt something stir deep within me, a sense of destiny fulfilled. I was where I was meant to be. For years, my life followed a routine as steady as the sunrise. I led prayers in the synagogue, taught scripture to eager students, and stood by my congregation in their most pivotal moments, weddings, births, funerals. I was there when new life was welcomed into the world and when beloved souls departed from it. I sat at hospital bedsides, held hands trembling with grief, and spoke words meant to heal. My wife, Rebecca, was my anchor, my constant, the quiet force that kept me grounded. She stood beside me through it all, raising our 3 children with patience and love while I devoted myself to my work. And yet, there were moments, fleeting but persistent, when I felt something stirring deep inside me. A whisper of doubt, a gnawing sense that something was missing. It wasn't that I didn't believe in God, I did, with every fiber of my being. But was my understanding of Him complete? I pushed those thoughts away, burying them beneath responsibility, ritual, and duty. Faith was not about questioning, it was about trust, about obedience. I had spent my entire life teaching others to trust in God, to surrender their uncertainties to Him. How could I admit that I, too, had questions I was too afraid to voice? So I continued, convincing myself that devotion was enough. That the unease pressing at the edges of my soul was nothing more than exhaustion. That my purpose was clear. That I knew God. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. And mine was about to be shaken in ways I could never have imagined. The fatigue started as a whisper, something easy to ignore. At first, I brushed it off as the natural consequence of long days and little rest. A rabbi's work is never done, I told myself. Between leading prayers, teaching scripture, and counseling those in need, exhaustion was an old companion. It was nothing. Or so I believed. But then came the pain. A dull ache in my stomach at first, annoying, but manageable. I told myself it was stress, the price of responsibility. I prayed through it. I pushed forward. What else was there to do? "You're working too hard, Jonathan," Rebecca said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. She reached across, placing her hand over mine, her eyes searching my face. "Maybe you should see a doctor." I forced a smile. "It's nothing," I assured her. "Probably indigestion." But it wasn't. The ache grew sharper, more insistent. It gnawed at me in the quiet moments, in the early morning hours before sunrise when I wrapped myself in my talith and whispered the morning blessings. It crept into my sermons, making my voice waver when it never had before. Then came the weight loss. The fatigue that sank into my bones, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Rebecca noticed. She always did. "Jonathan, please," she begged one night as I winced while standing up. "Go to the doctor. For me. For the kids." I sighed, rubbing my forehead. "All right," I murmured. "All right." The appointment was routine, nothing out of the ordinary. A few tests, some blood work. I expected to hear the usual: eat better. Rest more. Take it easy. Instead, I sat in the sterile, cold office of Dr. Howard, his voice a dull hum in the background, the words spilling from his lips like an incantation I couldn't quite decipher. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I stared at him, uncomprehending. The room felt too small, the air too thick. My ears rang. "Jonathan?" Rebecca's voice wavered beside me, tight with fear. I swallowed hard, but my throat had closed. My mind raced through my congregation. How many times had I sat beside someone in this very position, offering words of comfort? Words of faith. How many times had I said, "God has a plan. Trust in Him." But now, those words felt foreign. Hollow. Dr. Howard continued speaking, but I barely heard him. 6 months. Maybe less. Treatment options. Chemotherapy. No cure. I forced myself to breathe, to nod as if I understood, as if the ground beneath me hadn't just given way. I don't remember leaving the office. I remember Rebecca's grip on my hand, tight and desperate, as we walked through the parking lot. I remember the way the sky looked, an unnatural shade of blue, too bright, too indifferent to the storm raging inside me. I remember silence. Ours. The world's. At home, Rebecca sat beside me on the couch, her fingers trembling against mine. "We'll fight this," she whispered. "We'll do everything we can." I looked at her, the woman who had stood beside me for decades, and for the first time in our marriage, I had nothing to say. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the bookshelves lined with Torah commentaries, ancient wisdom passed down through generations. I had spent a lifetime teaching faith, guiding others through their trials. But now, I was the one drowning. I tried to pray. I needed to pray. "God," I whispered into the silence. "Give me strength. Give me understanding. Let me face this with faith." But there was no answer. Just the ticking of the clock. Just the emptiness pressing in. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of my desk, my knuckles white. Is this how it ends? I had devoted my entire life to serving God. And now? Now I was dying. A sickening thought curled around my mind, one I had never allowed myself to consider. Was this my punishment? I pushed the thought away, ashamed of it. But it lingered. That night, I lay in bed beside Rebecca, staring at the ceiling, my body aching with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. The words I had spoken to others so many times echoed in my mind. God is always with us. Trust in His plan. Faith will carry you through. But in that moment, I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Top of form. Bottom of form. The treatments began quickly, too quickly. There was no time to process, no time to truly accept what was happening. One moment, I was a man of faith, a pillar of my community, and the next, I was just another cancer patient, sitting in a sterile, windowless infusion room, hooked up to tubes that pumped poison into my veins. I had stood at countless hospital bedsides, praying over those who were sick, offering them words of comfort. But now, I was the one in the chair, shivering under the weight of exhaustion, my body rebelling against every attempt to save it. The chemotherapy was worse than I had imagined. The nausea came in violent waves, leaving me curled over the toilet, heaving until there was nothing left. The fatigue was relentless, a deep, consuming weariness that no amount of rest could cure. My once steady hands trembled when I reached for my prayer book, my voice cracked when I tried to recite the Psalms. I was breaking. Rebecca sat with me through every treatment, never leaving my side, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She tried to hide it, tried to be strong for me, but in the quiet moments, when she thought I was asleep, I could hear her crying. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered to her one night, my voice barely audible in the dark. She reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out together." Together. That was how it had always been. But deep down, I knew that this was something no one could do for me. Then came the doubt. In the late hours of the night, when the house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock, my mind wandered to places I never thought it would go. Why was this happening to me? I had spent my entire life serving God, guiding others through their suffering, preaching about faith in the face of trials. But what about now? Where was God in this? I tried to silence those thoughts, but they grew louder with every sleepless night, every moment spent staring at the ceiling, feeling my body betray me. Had I failed in some way? Had I misunderstood everything? One night, unable to take it anymore, I dragged myself out of bed and into my study. I opened the Torah, my fingers tracing the familiar pages, the words I had clung to my entire life. But they felt distant now, empty, like an echo of something I could no longer reach. I pressed my forehead against the desk, whispering, "God, where are you?" But the only answer was silence. And for the first time in my life, I was terrified that I was praying to nothing. That night felt different. The pain had been my constant companion for months, a dull ache that never truly left me. But this was something else. It was sharper, heavier, as if something inside me was unraveling, giving way to an unseen force pressing down on my chest. I gritted my teeth, clutching the arms of my chair, my breathing ragged. Rebecca sat across from me, her eyes flickering with worry as she watched me struggle. She had seen me in pain before, but this was worse. I could see it in her face. "Let me call the doctor," she pleaded, already reaching for her phone. I shook my head. No. No more hospitals. I just need a moment. But even as I spoke, a deep unease crept through me. My body felt foreign, my limbs heavy, as though the very essence of me was slipping away. My children were in the next room, whispering in hushed voices. I knew they were afraid. They had seen me grow weaker, had watched my once strong hands tremble, my voice, a voice that had once commanded congregations, reduced to a fragile rasp. I hated the way they looked at me now. Like I was already gone. A fresh wave of pain surged through me, and I gasped, clutching my stomach. Rebecca was by my side in an instant, her hands gripping mine. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I tried to smile, to offer her some reassurance, but even that felt impossible. My body was failing me, and for the first time, I couldn't push through it. I couldn't pray through it. Something inside me fractured. A terrifying realization settled deep in my chest. This was it. I tried to focus, tried to steady my breathing, but my mind was clouded by agony, by the overwhelming weight of what was happening. "God," I whispered into the silence, my voice barely more than a breath. "If this is my time, give me the strength to face it." But there was nothing. No warmth, no divine comfort. Just the steady, crushing force of the unknown. The room around me blurred. The walls, the ceiling, even Rebecca's face, they were all fading. A tightness gripped my chest, squeezing, crushing. My vision darkened at the edges, my limbs no longer my own. "Jonathan, stay with me." Rebecca's voice broke through the haze, panic laced in every word. I wanted to answer her. To tell her I was fine. To tell her I wasn't afraid. But I wasn't fine. And I was afraid. The last thing I saw was her face, streaked with tears as she called my name. Then, nothing. Darkness. Silence. And just when I thought it was over, when I was certain that I had slipped beyond the reach of life itself, I opened my eyes. But I was no longer in my body. I opened my eyes, or at least, I thought I did. But something was wrong. I wasn't in my body anymore. Below me, the scene was unfolding in horrifying clarity. Rebecca was kneeling on the floor beside me, shaking my shoulders, her cries frantic and raw. My children had rushed into the room, their faces pale with terror, their voices calling my name, pleading for me to wake up. The paramedics stormed in, their movements swift and practiced, shouting instructions, reaching for their equipment. And there I was. My body. Lifeless. Motionless. It should have terrified me. It should have sent me spiraling into panic. But instead, I felt nothing, no pain, no heaviness, just a strange, weightless calm. "I'm here." I tried to shout, but no sound came. I reached out for Rebecca, desperate to touch her, to reassure her, but my hand passed through her like mist. A cold realization crept over me. They couldn't see me. They couldn't hear me. I was separate. Detached. I should have been afraid, but the fear I had always imagined death would bring never came. Instead, there was a strange, eerie clarity, as if I had stepped out of time itself. I turned back toward my body. Was that really me? The hands that had once held Torah scrolls with reverence now lay limp and lifeless. The mouth that had spoken countless prayers was frozen in silence. The heart that had carried so much faith, had it truly stopped beating? Rebecca sobbed beside me, gripping my unresponsive hand, her voice breaking. "Come back, Jonathan. Please, just come back." I tried. God knows I tried. But I couldn't move, couldn't return, couldn't will myself back into the life I had known. And then, something changed. A glow flickered in the distance, not the harsh fluorescent lights of the ambulance, not the chaotic red and blue of emergency sirens. This light was different. Soft. Warm. It pulsed gently, almost as if it were alive, and I felt a pull, an undeniable force calling me toward it. The sounds of the world below, Rebecca's cries, the paramedics' urgent voices, the beeping of their machines, began to fade, dissolving into a distant hum. The light was drawing me in. And despite everything, despite the life I was leaving behind, I wasn't afraid. I drifted toward it, the warmth washing over me, wrapping around me like a familiar embrace. The deeper I moved into it, the more peace I felt, a peace unlike anything I had ever known. But just as I began to surrender to it, just as I allowed myself to let go, I heard something. Voices. Faint at first, then growing clearer. One was my mother's voice, soft and familiar, the same voice that had sung me to sleep as a child. Another was my father's, reciting an ancient prayer I hadn't heard in decades. The sound of them stirred something deep within me, a longing I couldn't explain. I hesitated. Was this death? Was I about to cross a threshold I could never return from? I moved closer, the pull becoming stronger, the light expanding, enveloping everything in its glow. I felt myself being pulled forward, deeper into the light. It wasn't just brightness, it was alive, pulsing with a warmth that seeped into me, filling every part of my being. The peace I had felt before intensified, washing over me like waves on the shore, dissolving every ounce of pain and fear I had carried in life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Then, the light shifted. Images flickered within it, not in front of me, but all around me, inside me, as if the light itself held the story of my life. I saw myself as a boy, running through the fields outside my childhood home in upstate New York, my mother's voice calling me inside for dinner. Her laughter rang in my ears, filled with a warmth that made my heart ache. Then, the scene changed. I was older now, a teenager, hunched over a Torah scroll, my father standing behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. His face was proud, his eyes filled with something I hadn't noticed then, hope. More images appeared, snapshots of my life woven into the fabric of time. My ordination as a rabbi. My first sermon. The day I married Rebecca, her eyes shining with love as she took my hand beneath the chuppah. I saw myself standing beside grieving families, whispering words of comfort at funerals, celebrating the births of new life, placing my hands on the shoulders of young men at their bar mitzvahs, blessing them as they stepped into adulthood. These weren't just memories. They were alive. I could feel everything, the joy, the sorrow, the weight of every choice I had ever made. And then, the warmth began to fade. The light dimmed, and with it, a strange, unfamiliar chill crept into the air. The golden glow that had embraced me moments ago started to dull, its edges darkening, flickering like a candle struggling against the wind. A faint sound filled the space. At first, it was barely a whisper, but it grew, a low, anguished moan, a sound of suffering so profound it made my soul tremble. Shapes began to emerge from the dimness. Figures, not distant, not blurred, but real. Men. Women. Even children. Their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow with a desperation that pierced through me. They reached out, hands clawing at the air as if begging for something, for help, for relief, for escape. A sickening wave of dread washed over me. Who were they? Why were they here? And, why was I seeing them? I stood frozen, trapped between the fading warmth of the light and the unbearable darkness that stretched before me. The figures in the distance were no longer just shadows, they were real, their twisted faces etched with suffering so profound it made my soul tremble. Their cries, once a faint murmur, now rose into a chorus of agony, filling the space around me like a suffocating fog. I wanted to move, to turn back toward the light that had embraced me only moments ago. But something held me in place. I wasn't just witnessing this, I was meant to see it. Then, a whisper drifted through the void, a voice unlike any I had ever heard. Soft, yet heavy with sorrow. Jonathan. The sound of my name sent a shiver through me. It wasn't a reprimand, nor was it filled with anger. It was something worse. It was disappointment. The cries of the figures grew louder, their hands reaching, desperate and pleading. Some clawed at the air as if trying to escape, their hollow eyes fixed on something unseen. Others collapsed in despair, their voices breaking into hopeless wails. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the anguished chorus. But deep down, I already knew the answer. They were the forgotten. The lost. The ones who had spent their lives searching for truth, only to reject it when it stood before them. I turned in every direction, searching for something, anything, that could make sense of what I was seeing. But the darkness only thickened, stretching endlessly. Why am I here? My own voice wavered, shaking with something I hadn't felt in decades. Fear. A pause. Then the voice returned, steady, unwavering. Because you spent your life searching for me, but you never truly knew me. A weight dropped into my chest. That's not true, I protested, shaking my head. I served you. I devoted my life to teaching your word. I led others to faith. I was a rabbi. And yet, you never sought me beyond what you thought you understood. The word struck like a blade. I staggered backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind reeled, trying to grasp what was happening. I had spent my life serving God. Studying Torah, leading prayers, offering guidance, following the commandments. Hadn't I done everything He asked of me? But as I stood there, surrounded by the echoes of those who had also thought they knew the truth, a realization unraveled me. I had spent my life teaching about God, but had I ever truly known Him? Had I mistaken knowledge for understanding? Had I spent so much time studying the words of the prophets that I had failed to recognize His presence? My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, my hands pressing against the emptiness beneath me. I thought I was doing what was right, I whispered. I thought I knew you. The voice did not respond. Instead, the figures in the distance grew closer. One by one, they turned their hollow, grieving eyes toward me. And in that moment, I saw myself in them. Everything changed. The cries around me faded, the suffering faces dissolving into shadows. The darkness, which had pressed against me like an unbearable weight, began to crack apart. A force, immense, unstoppable, and unlike anything I had ever known, rushed through me, pulling me upward, away from the torment, away from the hollow despair. The dim glow that had once surrounded me was replaced by something brighter, something more real than reality itself. Then, a voice, the same voice that had questioned me, that had shattered my illusions, that had exposed the truth I had spent my life avoiding, spoke. It is not yet your time. I tried to speak, to protest, to understand, but before I could, the world around me collapsed in on itself, vanished in an instant. And then, agony. Pain crashed over me like a tidal wave, slamming into my chest, dragging me back into the confines of my body. My lungs burned, my limbs convulsed, my skin felt as though it had been set on fire. A violent gasp tore from my throat as I was thrust back into the world I thought I had left behind. My eyes flew open, and a single, unshakable truth erupted from the depths of my soul, tearing through the silence like a thunderclap. Jesus is God. The words left my lips before I even had time to understand them, before my mind could catch up with the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. My chest heaved, my breath ragged, my body trembling as I gasped for air. I was back. The fluorescent lights above burned into my retinas, harsh and sterile. The beeping of machines, the murmured voices of doctors, the sterile scent of antiseptic, it all rushed at me in a suffocating wave. I was alive. But I wasn't the same. I felt the weight of my body again, the dull ache of my limbs, the heaviness of my existence pressing down on me. Yet, none of it felt as real as what I had just seen, as what had just been revealed to me. My mind reeled, my thoughts spiraling, trying to hold on to something, anything, that could make sense of what had just happened. I turned my head, my vision still blurred, and saw her, Rebecca. Her face hovered above me, pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with disbelief. The moment our gazes locked, a sob tore from her throat, and she collapsed onto my chest, gripping me as though afraid I would slip away again. "Jonathan," she gasped, her fingers digging into the thin fabric of my hospital gown. "Oh, God. I thought I lost you." I struggled to speak, to form words, but my throat felt raw, as if it had carried the weight of eternity itself. My fingers curled weakly around her hand. My voice cracked. I swallowed hard. I saw him. Rebecca pulled back slightly, searching my face, confusion flickering through her tear-filled eyes. Saw who? I stared past her, at the ceiling, at the empty air, but I could still see him, his eyes, filled with love and sorrow, his presence so overwhelming, so undeniable. "Jesus," I whispered. Then, stronger, I saw Jesus. A stunned silence filled the room. Rebecca's grip on me tightened. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. I could see the war inside her, the conflict, the fear. This wasn't something I would have ever said. Not before. Not ever. "Jonathan." She finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" I tried to sit up, but my body felt like lead, as if my soul had barely managed to reattach itself. My mind was still caught between two worlds, between the man I had been and the truth I could no longer deny. I turned my gaze to her, my heart pounding, the weight of revelation pressing against my ribs. "I was wrong," I choked out, the words like broken glass on my tongue. "Rebecca, I spent my entire life thinking I knew God. But I didn't." Tears streamed down her face. "Jonathan, you're scaring me." I swallowed hard, reaching for her hand, desperate for her to understand, for someone, anyone, to understand the magnitude of what I had just experienced. "I died," I told her, my voice hoarse. "I left my body. I saw myself, I saw you crying, the doctors trying to save me. And then, there was a light. And the voices, my mother's voice, my father's." My breath hitched as the memories surged forward, vivid and undeniable. But it wasn't just them. There were others, Rebecca. So many others. People lost, suffering, and I was almost one of them. A shudder passed through me. I could still hear their cries, still feel the despair that had surrounded them, that had almost swallowed me whole. But then, I continued, my hands trembling, I heard a voice. Not just any voice, it was him. Jesus. And he asked me if I truly knew God. Rebecca's breath hitched. And my vision blurred with tears. And I realized I didn't. A sob tore through me, shaking me to my very core. The truth was too big, too overwhelming, too devastating to contain. I had spent my entire life studying God, preaching about Him, teaching His laws, but I had never actually known Him. Not fully. Not completely. Not in the way I had seen Him in those final moments before the light took me. And Jesus, He was there. He had always been there, waiting, watching, offering the very truth I had spent decades searching for in the wrong places. The weight of it crushed me. I had been a rabbi, a teacher, a leader, guiding others with certainty, and yet I had been blind. Rebecca shook her head, tears spilling over. Jonathan, I don't understand. What are you saying? I turned to her, my entire being trembling with the realization that had just shattered everything I had ever believed. I'm saying that Jesus is the way, I whispered, my voice filled with something between grief and awe. I'm saying that He is who He says He is. That I was wrong. I looked past her, past the walls of the hospital, past everything that had once felt solid and real, and I exhaled a breath that carried the weight of a lifetime of misunderstanding. Jesus is God. I should not be here. I should not have returned. But by the mercy of God, I did. And I came back with a truth that I can never deny. Jesus is God. Before my near-death experience, I thought I knew everything about faith. I spent my life studying Scripture, teaching others about God, and guiding people in their spiritual journeys. But when I crossed that threshold between life and death, I realized something that shook me to my core. I had known of God, but I had never truly known Him. I saw the lost, those who had spent their lives searching for truth yet rejecting it when it stood right before them. I almost became one of them. But in the darkest moment, I heard His voice. Jesus. He asked me a question that unraveled everything I had built my life upon. Have you truly known me? And in that instant, I understood, I had been blind. I had been so focused on rituals, traditions, and knowledge that I had missed the most important truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Now, I am here to share this with you. This is not just my story, it is a call to faith. What happened to me was real. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. If you were in my place, standing at the edge of eternity, what would you feel? Would you be ready? If you believe in the power of faith, I invite you to leave your prayer in the comments. I will pray for you, just as I was prayed for. And if this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, subscribe, and share this video, because someone out there needs to hear this truth today.